So tonight's lesson number 20, is United Monarchy of David under Saul. So last time we covered kind of Samuel, Saul. Now this is David under Saul. And it's a very interesting time period to look at. And David is one of these characters in the Bible that we get a lot of detail about. We don't often get that about the other characters. And all of the kings that come after this, they don't get as much volume as David does. And all the other kings after this are measured by David. But there's a lot of stuff that happens during this time period that's really important for us to grasp because of the theology that it reveals to us and so on and so forth. So, yeah, there you go. First, I want to talk a little bit about Israelite religion at this point, like what is happening. I do want to bring out the correction here. I always hate it when you discover that you were wrong about something. And I have to say that I'm really disappointed you guys didn't catch me in it. Jadine. No, just kidding. When I was in the basic training, there's one time that we were out in the field and it was really cold. And so they were lighting these burn barrels to keep us warm. And one of the drill sergeants wanted to light the burn barrel by taking a paper airplane and lighting it on fire and throwing it into the burn barrel. And when he did that, it blew his hat off. And we all got in trouble for not catching his hat before it hit the ground. So that's kind of what this is like. You guys should have caught my mistake and figured it out. But the correction is this. I hadn't stated clearly one way or the other whether the tabernacle was or was not destroyed. And I don't know how I missed this other than the fact that it's a lot later in the story of David than you'd expect to hear about it, being in 1 Chronicles 21. But it says in 1 Chronicles 21, 29, 30, for the tabernacle, Lord, which Moses had made in the wilderness, and the altar of burnt offering were at that time in the high place of Gibeon. But David could not go before it to inquire of the Lord, for he was afraid of the sword of the angel of the Lord. This is at the very end of David's life that it says this. And so I don't know if I just didn't catch it because of that. But it very clearly is the tabernacle that was made in the wilderness. So it was not destroyed at where did my brain just go? Come on, what city is it? It was not Shiloh. So it was not destroyed at Shiloh by the Philistines. It did survive. But then it's interesting then that because of that, what we see here is that the ark during this time is still actually with at Kiriath Jearim, and then at eventually during it's when David will be at the time next week that they're going to move the ark. But while the ark is at Kiriath Jearim, it seems that the tabernacle may be set up at Gibeah. It does not say in this passage how far back, but we do know that when the ark, as we're going to see next week, when the ark is brought to Jerusalem, that at that time David sets up a tent, and there's a keeping of the ark, and then there's also the tabernacle at Gibeah that's being kept by the high priest separately, and we'll talk about that next week. So with these two kind of being divided, you also still have the habit of the people using high places other than just the tabernacle and other than Jerusalem. That becomes significant because, again, once the temple was built, it's expected that the people just stop using those high places. And yet, we'll find that they continue to use them. Each of the kings are evaluated as to whether or not they've walked in the steps of their father David. And it'll say, they did, but they didn't take down the high places, or they did take down the high places. And so it would seem that these high places, are not a good thing, but it's also extremely understandable why the people would have thought it was okay, because they did so for many years before David built the temple. Household idols. This is an interesting thing. When in one of the stories tonight, we're going to see that David is fleeing from Saul, and his wife is able to keep him hidden by taking a household idol and putting it into his bed and letting it pretend. So it's a decent-sized idol because it was big enough to imitate David. And so is that just a statue that he has, which they were still told not to have? They were supposed to have graven images. Was this actually an image that was used in any sort of worship? We don't know. Maybe not, with it being David's house, but at the same time, we do know at this time in Israel, there still is kind of an acceptance of other gods. The Passover is only partially being celebrated. From what we read in 2 Chronicles 35:18, which is when when Josiah, I believe, celebrates the Passover and finally does it to its full extent that he was supposed to. It said that it had not been done that way since before, I think Samuel, maybe until the time of Joshua. So there's things being done, but they're not being done just right to the law. And one of the things that you pick up more in this section of Scripture than other sections is the celebration of the new moons, because this seems to be a pretty big deal within the relationship of David and Saul, because Saul is expecting David to be at each of these feasts of the new moon, and his absence becomes a problem. So that gives us a little picture into what's happening in Israelite religion at this point. So David, his life makes a few key points to us, and a big part of it is his waiting and trusting on the Lord. It's said multiple times that he does not raise his hand against the Lord's anointed. And he says, I will not do that. And remember, he was also anointed. Samuel had already anointed him. And yet he would not take the action to make it happen, even when it seems like it is just handed to him on a silver platter. And this goes to show that he doesn't, in a sense, trust himself to be making that decision. And he waits instead for the Lord to do it. And one of the things we're going to find is that a very positive result of that is that the people then trusted him, so that when Saul was finally killed and when the power did finally go to David, it went fully to David, and they trusted him because there wasn't any way in which he was involved in that death, and it helped to unify the nation. So you see in that a wisdom, not just in the sense of honoring the Lord, but also a wisdom in how to lead people. Another thing that we're told eventually is that as David goes and conquers, he hamstrings the horses and burns the chariots. So why would you hamstring the horses and burn the chariots? We've talked a little bit about this in the past, but why would we do that?
Depending on God's power.
Yeah. So, and it's interesting that you actually take an action to show you're depending on God's power. I mean, there's kind of the sense of, if he didn't hamstring the horses and burn the chariots, would that automatically have meant he wasn't depending on God's power? No, not necessarily, because he was depending on God's power before he got the horses and the chariots. But what you see is in his heart, he wants to go out of the way to make sure everybody knows it was God that did it. And when it says then that David is a man after God's own heart, that's a big part of what we see, is that it's not just, that, okay, well, I'm doing things in the okay way. It's like he loves the Lord and he wants the Lord to be glorified, and he goes out of his way to make that more so by what he does. His one bad thing that comes out that we see is numbering the people. Of course, we also see, we're going to see in a few weeks, the thing with Bathsheba. But the numbering the people, when it comes to the issue of trusting in the Lord, showed that he, in his later years, fell away from that trust and numbered the people and did what should not have been done. And one of the reasons why the punishment for the numbering of the people was so severe is because it was a fall away from this norm of trusting God. It was a change in what David was doing. And this is where we're going to see throughout Scripture, there is always that danger as men get older, that they get less on their guard about their own character, and they end up falling and doing stuff in their latter years that they wouldn't have done earlier. You had that with Moses, where he strikes the rock. You have it with Gideon and the things that he did. You have it here with David, and there's a number of people you can go through and see that in the latter years that ended up happening because of their pride and other things that happened. There's King Asa, for instance, who seems to actually have a struggle with physical problems towards the end that made him really turn away and do what was wrong. We also see in the life of David the Holy Spirit being brought forward. This is where you really see the Spirit of God leaves Saul and leads to Saul's demise, and then comes upon David and is very strong within David and functions within David. And we see that Saul notices that the Spirit of the Lord is upon David, and that provokes him to jealousy because he realizes what that means. But you see the Spirit of God being a major part of what David is doing. So there's 5 key stages to David's life. First, David in the service of Saul. Then David as a fugitive from Saul. Then David being over Judah only, and then over all of Israel. And then David's troubles post Bathsheba. Now, the first 2 stages here are what we're going to cover tonight, in the service of Saul and a fugitive from Saul. Then next week we're going to cover Judah and when he's over just Judah and over all Israel in David's good years, is what you could call them. And then the third week we're going to cover David's troubles, everything that he experiences post Bathsheba. So, David's first role with Saul was as a calming musician. So when the Spirit of the Lord left Saul, it says that a bad spirit came upon him, or the Lord sent a bad spirit upon him to torment him. And Saul's people in his court suggest, hey, why don't you get somebody to play the harp or the lyre and have that music calm you, and maybe that will help. And Saul likes this idea. And so when they're asking about this, and trying to figure out what to do, a young man pipes up and says, hey, I know a guy. He's the son of Jesse. And as it says here, he was referred to as one who is skillful in playing, and he's a man of valor, a man of war, prudent in speech, and a man of good presence, and the Lord is with him. Now, this is significant because this is happening before David fights Goliath. So, him already being known as a man of valor and a man of war before he goes and fights Goliath. We typically portray the David and Goliath as this little kid walking out who's 13, 14 tops, and he stands against the great Goliath, and he has this little slingshot, and he hasn't been in battle at all, and that's not the picture at all that Scripture actually has when we look closer to it. We will actually see and notice that there was chances for him to experience battle before he got to there, and he actually was staying at the camp with the Israelites when the thing with Goliath happens. He just happened to be gone to go be with it, take care of his dad. So it says here, at the time of his encounter with Goliath, David was taking a break from his service as Saul's musician and armor bearer to go and tend his father's sheep. Now, David became Saul's musician. It says as Saul loved him and made him his armor bearer, which meant that David would have gone with Saul into battle. He would have gone and camped with him. And there seems to be a decent amount of time between him being made musician and the battle with Goliath. The other thing that you see here is in 1 Samuel 17:54, after the battle with Goliath, he says that he takes the weapons of Goliath and he brings them to his own tent. So he had his own tent in the battle, in that encampment with the Israelites. When he does come and see his brothers like, oh, who's back taking care of the sheep? His brothers are probably jealous and upset because David's camped up with Saul because he's his armor bearer. And so when you see that jealousy with the brothers, it has more to do with that than here's this little kid and they're deriding, little brother. So when David goes to fight Goliath, he's probably actually much older than what we think, typically. Now, the interesting thing with this is that when David does fight Goliath, at the end of that time, Saul says, who is this guy's father? What family does he come from? And he turns to his commander, and he's like, Abner, who is this guy's father? He's like, as Lord lives, I have no clue. You're thinking, wait, how is he an armor bearer to the king, beloved musician, and yet they don't even know who his family is, and such like that. So a couple of things to consider with this. One, the main reason he's concerned about David's family at this point is because of what was promised to the person who defeated Goliath. It was promised, one, that he was going to marry off his daughter to them. So family lineage is going to matter with that. It was also promised that whoever defeated that, his father's house would become free in Israel, which probably meant that no taxation, they would then live honored in Israel. And I don't know if you guys ever knew that was probably a result of the David and Goliath, but his brother should have been happy after that point. So inquiring about David's house was because he had to know who the father was and who the house was in order to reward him. And then you were like, well, how come they didn't already know that? And if you look carefully at when they select David as the musician, they actually say within the passage that it is messengers and servants that are carrying it. So Saul's like, they suggest David to Saul. Saul's like, sounds good, go get him. But all the rest seems to be done by other messengers and other people. And so that would have been just a small blip on Saul's screen. Abner was probably not even there. And so remembering who the parent was and such like that might not have actually been something that they could do, because he was more familiar with David, but not with his family. So that's probably why you see that showing up. And it seems strange that Saul would know it, but that's probably why. So, in David's victory over Goliath, first, who is Goliath? Goliath was likely one of these that seemed to be descended from the Nephilim. You guys remember way back when we started going through, we got to Genesis 6 and we talked about the Nephilim. And these were those that would have been the offspring of the sons of God coming down and having children with the daughters of men. We explained back at that time about the possibility of the sons of God being like what we consider like the pagan gods to be, and that they had ways of making sure through the genetics of their children that they turned out to be very strong and powerful human beings that were much taller and stronger and so on and so forth. Now we say that Goliath is connected with the Nephilim because in 1 Samuel 17:4, going from the bottom up, we see that Goliath is from Gath. Joshua 11:22 says that the Anakim are still in Gath. Numbers 13:33 say that the sons of Anak, which are the Anakim, are part of the Nephilim. And then you have Genesis 6:4 referencing the Nephilim. So there is kind of that direct flow from Goliath all the way back. When David fights Goliath, like I said, he's likely in his late teens or his early 20s. When he comes, he hears the challenge of Goliath. He hears all of what is going on, and he is just incensed by what Goliath is saying. And he keeps saying, we need to take this guy on. That gets brought before Saul, and then he goes before Saul. And you will notice that when he's brought before Saul, there isn't this sense of no familiarity. He actually arrives, he refers to himself as your servant, which doesn't necessarily prove a whole lot, because anybody would have done that to King Saul. But it seems that he is there and they know who he is. And so when Saul goes to give David his armor, remember at this point he's Saul's armor bearer. And so he's saying, hey, take my armor and go. This is, better armor. I do wonder, just because of Saul's insecurities and vanities that we see, if he is not hoping that the Philistines think it's him that ends up taking out Goliath. We're not told anything to that end in the passage. But when David tries on this armor, we typically will portray it as the armor was too big and jangling around him. But David is said to be a handsome young man at this point. And he probably was decent size, and it says that the armor was untested, not that it was too big. Now, how many of you guys have ever put on football pads or actual military equipment like a helmet and everything else like that, and then tried to actually run and be active. You have, it's a lot different, isn't it? Like when you put on, you have to put it all on, and then you have to be active. You have to be used to that. You have to be used to having all that stuff on. The first time I went into a mock battle with all of my military gear on, all my ammo belt, my weapon, my helmet, and I'm running, and the helmet's like jostling on my head, and my eyeballs are like moving, so it's like I can't see half of where I'm running. I'm like, this is weird. And so it is, when you're not used to fighting with armor and it's untested, it means you're not able to, you haven't sat there and know how to move with it, is the basic idea that's being brought out there. Not that it was too large, which actually is interesting, because that would tell you that he wasn't too much smaller than Saul, who was pretty tall. And so we're never told whether David was short or tall. We also know that his son Absalom ends up being quite tall. So it could be that David was decently tall. Then when he kills Goliath, Goliath promises to feed him to the birds, and David likewise returns the promise, except David kept his. And as they're coming together, you have Goliath, who has a spear, a javelin, and a sword. So he's got 3 weapons on him, plus a shield bearer who's walking in front of him with a shield. And David comes out, no armor, and just a sling. And he goes charging into the battle, runs at Goliath, and throws the single stone at his forehead, although he picked up 5. And that single stone, it says, sinks into the forehead of Goliath and basically takes him down. It's a little bit hard to tell whether it's the stone that completely killed Goliath, or the fact that David took Goliath's sword and cut his head off when he was done, because it says in both verses that he killed Goliath with the stone and then he killed Goliath with the sword. And so it's, you kind of see which one it is. But pretty much once he was knocked out with the stone, it was a foregone conclusion. David, at that point, takes Goliath's head and all the armor. So he takes all the armor off of Goliath, takes the head of Goliath, brings the head of Goliath to Jerusalem, actually, and then takes the weaponry to his tent. Now, it could be that the weaponry in his tent is like his tent back at his dad's or whatever. It doesn't seem that way in the context, but it could be either one. Goliath's death, however, meant that the Philistines fled, and there was a great victory, and the Israelites defeated them, and now there was this praise that was going to David, but they actually were starting to turn the tide against the Philistines. And from this point on, the tide has been turned against the Philistines. The Philistines start losing and losing and losing and losing, and the Israelite kingdom starts gaining and gaining and gaining. At this time, though, also with when he conquers Goliath, it says that basically Jonathan, Saul's son, his heart was knit together with David's. Now, realize Jonathan at this time is actually at least 10 years older than David, from the way that it seems. And so when he's knit together with David, he sees him almost like a son, and immediately they become best friends. Now, what is it, when you guys think about the story of Jonathan that we would talk about last week, and then you think about what just happened with David, what is it, do you think, that knit the two of them together so closely?
Their love for the Lord, perhaps.
Okay, their love for the Lord.
Unlikely victories.
Unlikely victories. In the same manner. I mean, Jonathan saying God can rescue by many or by few. David. So in really, it's the strength of these two men's faith. They both step out. They both have that zeal for the Lord. They both have that strong faith. They and that courage. And they just immediately click because of that. And the two of them are best of friends for the rest of their life. So in the fight with Goliath, this is a picture of the area where that battle was. Adullam is going to, you're going to see that on a map in a little bit. Adullam is where David ends up hiding from Saul for quite a while. The Elah Valley is where this battle is occurring. The Philistines are camped between Sukkoth and I think the other city it gives is not Aphek, but there's a city that's right here off the map. I can't remember the name, but it is in Scripture, but they're camped in between those. And so the Philistine camp was most likely here. It might possibly have been here, but we don't know exactly where Sukkah was. It could be here or it could be here, and so it really just kind of depends on which one, and then it could be either one of those. I believe the Philistine camp was more likely here, because we'll see when we get to the other map that once you get over to this part where you see it's just a plain, that's basically the line of the Philistines right there. And then Israelite camp was either here or behind the hill, but it says that they were camped in the Elah Valley, so I definitely lean more towards the Israelite camp being here. The problem with that is that's not a defensible position. If you were in the military, you'd realize not a great place to be. So it would seem like they might be up in this area here, and then they would go up to the battle lines here, and the Philistines would go up to their battle lines here. And typically in the military, what you have when you go out to battle, you have we called it the rear trains, but it's this camp that's in the back where all your stuff is. And then you go up into battle, so you don't have to carry your tents and everything into battle with you. It's all back behind you. David, for instance, when he arrives at the battle, he's bringing bread and cheese and everything from his dad for his brothers. He doesn't take all that up into the battle with him. He goes to the guy that's watching their baggage. That's what it's referred to. And he hands it to them, and then he goes up to the battle. And that would have been the guys that are back watching the camp that's back behind the battle lines. The actual battle lines were made up on these hills, and it says that they were each on hills on either side of the valley. And so that was quite likely right here, possibly here, but it just kind of depends on how you would line it up. So the battle between David and Goliath most likely occurred here or in this section here, and the creek that runs through there is where David would have picked up his stones. And I forgot to grab them from my office. I have a couple of stones from that creek bed. Should have done that. Oh well. Maybe I'll bring them next week. So, but you can go and stand in this valley today and stand there and look. And this is where David fought Goliath. No, you will not be able to pick up a stone from that day, because they actually have to keep replenishing that creek bed with stones all the time, because so many people take stones from the creek bed. So go figure. So that the battle as it occurred. So once Goliath fell, the Philistines would have fled back toward the land of the Philistines. The Israelites would have pursued them, and that would have been the end of the matter. To give you guys an idea, Jerusalem, if you're on this map, Jerusalem would be about like right here. It might be off. Yeah, I can just see myself on the screen. So that's where Jerusalem would have been. So this isn't too far from Jerusalem. So David and Jonathan's friendship. So a couple things about Jonathan. By the way, Calvin and Hobbes are just awesome. That's why I had to put it in there. But Jonathan was capable of surrendering his throne to David, which tells you he is not like his father. He is the complete opposite of Saul. He does not try to keep the kingdom for himself. He accepts the Lord's pronouncement about his family. And not only does he, say, I'll put the throne over to David, but he's like, I will serve at your right hand. He actually says, I will serve under you. And it's just an amazing thing. So that character probably came from his mother. I say that because Saul blames it on his mother, because when he wants to be compassionate towards David, he refers to him as you son of a perverse woman, which is a very nice way of translating what's actually in the Hebrew, because he's actually calling him a blankety blank 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 at that moment, but we don't put that in our Bibles because otherwise you have to read them out loud in public readings and people get mad. So so it's this, he's mad, but it still is this reference to his mother, and it likely is something where you see this character being developed by his mom, which, as we go through all the kings of Israel, you're going to notice that it references their mom. And that's unusual, very unusual for ancient times to put the mothers down as something that mattered. But not only does it seem to matter, but there's sometimes a correspondence between if it was a Gentile mom and how the king turned out, or a mom that was not seeming to be faithful to the Lord, then versus when the mother seemed to be somebody who was godly. So that Jonathan and David actually make a covenant with each other. So they're saying that the Lord will be between me and you, and between my descendants and your descendants forever. And this covenant is kept. So for Jonathan keeps it by not allowing David to be killed. He risks his own life a couple of times to rescue David's life. And then David, when he becomes king, takes in Mephibosheth, which is Jonathan's son, and any of the other sons of Jonathan. There was a time when they were seeking out descendants of Saul, and David made sure that none of Jonathan's kids and descendants were in that. So he honors that covenant as well. And this is actually a real beautiful model of the friendship. It said of these that the deep love between them exceeded that of the love between a man and a woman. And that's saying a lot. And so these two guys were very deep friends. And I think sometimes, we think of love automatically when we go to romance and such like that. But this just shows you the love that can develop between two men of the like faith who are completely sold out to the Lord and completely faithful to the Lord. Just how much fellowship they have and the depth of the friendship that can come from that. So what happens now is David is in the service of Saul, and while he's in the service of Saul, there are a couple of attempts that are made on David's life. So first, Saul's made jealous because of the songs of the young women where they say that David has killed his 10,000s and Saul has killed his thousands. They say it in the opposite order, but you just see that ego pricking of Saul. This is an interesting thing just about human nature. We don't, especially if it's in the same realm as what we're good at, we don't always like hearing the praise of somebody else from somebody saying, oh, they're so good at this when you do the same thing that they're talking about. Do you guys know what I'm talking about at all? Any of you feel that at all, or am I just the only evil one in the room? It's you hear that and it provokes that jealousy. And sometimes that's important for us to take into account before we offer compliments in certain contexts. If you're at work, for instance, and you're going to offer a compliment, but it's going to provoke jealousy with this other person, you may not want to do that because it isn't always that beneficial to have that done, because it's a real pain to deal with this jealousy, as you're going to see David having to deal with it here. One question at this point is, had he heard by this point of the anointing that David had been anointed? Because these passages, so we take time to read it. Where are we at time-wise? Yeah, let's go ahead. If somebody could read the 1 Samuel 20, 30 to 31. You want to do that one? Janine, could you take 1 Samuel 24, 20 and 21? So 1 Samuel 24, 20, 20 is that middle one there. Anyone else? Okay, Max, why don't you take the 25, verse 30. Let's go ahead and read those real quick.
Then Saul's anger was kindled against Jonathan, and he said to him, "You son of a perverse, rebellious woman, do I not know that you have chosen the son of Jesse to your own shame and to the shame of your mother's nakedness? For as long as the son of Jesse lives on the earth, neither you nor your kingdom shall be established. Therefore send and bring him to me, for he shall surely die.
So the idea that he already knows that if he stays alive, he's going to be king. So it seems like he might know. Judine, read your passage.
This seems to be Paul speaking. I know that you will surely be king, and that the kingdom of Israel will be established in your hands. Now swear to me by the Lord that you will not cut off my descendants or wipe out my name from my father's family.
Okay, so here this confidence, I know you're the next guy. And then the last one. Next.
1 Samuel 25:30.
Yep.
And when the Lord has done to my Lord according to all the good he has spoken concerning you, and has appointed you prince over Israel.
So he knew that the Lord had spoken about David and what would be accomplished. So it seems that somehow the news of the anointing with Samuel had gotten out. And Saul had gotten wind of that and knew that David was the one that had been chosen to take it. When exactly that happens is harder to tell. Especially since that last one, Max, that you read, which is the most clear one, comes later on in the story. So in this jealousy, Saul makes some attempts on David's life. The first one, David is just sitting there playing his harp, trying to help calm Saul, and Saul decides to take a spear and try to pin him to the wall with it. And he is not successful with this. So then he makes an attempt on David's life through marriage. So he had promised for defeating Goliath that David would get to marry one of his daughters. But the daughter that was his oldest daughter that would have been married, David actually says no, in the sense of, who am I? Who am I to be married? I am of no account. I should not be marrying your daughter. I'm not worthy of that. And so he doesn't accept it, and then that daughter gets married off. However, the next daughter of Saul is in love with David and actually really likes David, which makes me wonder if that was also part of why David put off with that one. And when Saul finds out that they're in love, it's pleasing to him. So it may be that David had no interest in the first daughter, because now when Michal is offered to him, he says the same thing. But now Saul's like, well, you're right, but here's my bride price then. You have to go get me 100 Philistine foreskins. So he has to go kill 100 Philistines, and David, being the overachiever that he is, brings 200. The idea that Saul had was there's no way he's going to do this without being killed. The other thing about this is really gross. This is really gross. When you stop and you think about what's happening here, it's like, you definitely will not see this in Flannelgraph. But there's actually a book that's available, and you can see it online. I don't recommend it because it's actually an atheist who has taken all of these scenes from Scripture that most people don't realize are there, that have a whole lot of graphic content one way or the other, and he portrays all of these scenes in Legos. So he does this Lego scene of everything, but it gets to be sacrilegious at points, and but some of them are pretty funny. And they really make you think about how little we know of what's actually happening in Scripture, and that an atheist tends to know it almost better than we do. But this is one of those things. He goes out, he has to kill 200 Philistines, and Saul's thinking, one, he's either not going to achieve this, or two, it's going to turn the Philistines against him, so he's a marked man. And by this point, David is a marked man by the Philistines, but he is actually going to end up going and being on the Philistine side, at least apparently, toward in a little bit. And the Philistines are actually going to kind of come to accept him. But then you have Jonathan. So after he does this, he gets married to Michal. And then you have Jonathan's first intercession, where Saul responds to wanting David to be put to death. And Jonathan's like, no, why? What does he have to do that? And that's where we read, you son of a perverse woman, like, why are you doing this? Why are you defending him? But then after his attempt to put David to death, Saul kind of repents, and David actually returns to the service of Saul for a time. Then there's a battle, and David is very successful in every single battle that's happening. David is getting more and more success with the Philistines. Saul is getting jealous once more. So he again attempts to spear him to the wall and fails. And then he tries to capture him at his house, but his own daughter, Michal, helps him escape by putting the household idol in the bed and then letting him out secretly. And so he's able to flee. So when David flees, he flees to Ramah, which is where Samuel is. So he actually flees to go live with Samuel for a time. So Samuel is still alive, even though we're not hearing a lot about him in the story. And so he goes to Samuel, and then this is when Saul finds out, hears about it, sends men to go take David captive from Samuel. And when the men arrive where they're at, they just start prophesying. And then it comes back. So it's like they just start preaching. And then it gets back to Saul that happened. He sends more men, and they go out and they just start preaching. And so he sends more men, and they just start preaching. Then he goes himself, and he starts preaching and prophesying. And then it's kind of like, okay, this is, we're all good. And then it seems like things will be okay, and he's not going to pursue David. But that's not the case. This time, David is supposed to be going to, he's kind of restored things with Saul, but he's supposed to be going to this new moon. And this time, David not showing up at doesn't want to show up at the new moon because he's afraid for his life. And this is where Jonathan again defends David and gets a spear thrown at him and risks his life with that. And so then Jonathan ends up going out to David. And this is where, David had set up the thing with Jonathan with shooting the arrow out in the field to determine, is Saul out to kill you for sure or not? And so when it is confirmed, then there's this tearful farewell between Jonathan and David where they realize they're going to be separated. And from this point on, David and Jonathan are more separated as friends. They're not able to be together through the rest of what we see in the story. So David was in Michmash and had fled to Ramah where Samuel was. And then when he flees from Ramah to Gibeah. And then from Gibeah, it's where he flees to Nob. So we see, you can follow a little bit on the map that's here with David as a fugitive, but we're also going to be covering the material that's on the other page. So when he gets to Nob is this priestly city. So Jerusalem would be right here. This is like downtown Jerusalem. The old city is right in this area here. Gibeah is pretty close here. And the tabernacle would be right in this region or at Gibeah. Gibeah is kind of multiple hills right here. And then you have the priests being at Nob. It's a priestly city, if that's just because of how close it was to where the tabernacle was. But David goes there, and it seems like there's the bread from the worship and everything is there at Nob, so it's hard to tell why the tabernacle's not there. But when he goes to Nob, fleeing, he's alone. He's all by himself, and he didn't have time to grab his weapons and stuff like that. So he goes to the tabernacle and he takes the sword of Goliath. Now, this is why when it says that he took the weapons into his own tent, it may be that he did that so he could dedicate them to the Lord, and then he gave them over to the tabernacle or something as an honor to the Lord. So when he gets to Nob, that sword is given to him, and for the rest of his days, he uses Goliath's sword. So that's the sword of David that we're going to see him, having battles with from here on out. At Nob as well, he has there are men that join him, Actually, I'm trying to think if they joined him at Gibeah. They might have done that. So when he got to Nob, he wasn't alone. And then when he has the bread, or he needs food for him and the men that are with him. And so the priest gives him the bread of the presence, which is what Jesus references in the Gospels. Like, did not they give the bread of the presence to David? And so he gets the sword, he gets the bread, and he goes with his men to leave and to flee from Israel. Now, when this happens, he flees to Gath, but there was a gentleman that saw David speaking to the priests at Nob, and that gentleman goes back and reports that to Saul. And if I remember correctly, the gentleman was an Edomite, and when he tells Saul, Saul sends to the city of Nob and kills everyone, the entire city, for having helped David. Only one man escapes, and that is Abiathar, and he now, as a result of this killing, is, I think he's the only, but at least one of the few remaining descendants of Eli, who was the high priest. And he goes and is with David and stays with David through the rest of his days. Remember Abiathar, because he becomes an important figure. He's an important counselor to David throughout the years of his reign. But at the very end, he ends up, or toward the end, he ends up siding with Absalom and therefore losing the favor with David. So David flees to Gath, and when he's first at Gath, this is where everyone starts to go, wait a minute, this is the guy. This is the one. This is the one that keeps beating us in battle. This is the guy that came and got 200 of our guys. And they start identifying him, and he's in a lot of trouble. So David starts like drooling and pretending that he's all insane and just, like all whacked out. And they're like, well, he's more miserable this way. We're going to leave him this way. And they kick him out. And so he quick flees and runs away. I mean, that's just some quick thinking there, just to suddenly just start drooling and acting insane. So he flees from Gath, and this is when he goes to Adullam. Now, when I had showed you guys during the fight of David and Goliath, that valley that we looked at is the valley that's right here, that kind of comes right through this area here. So he flees to Adullam, probably through that very same valley, and you can kind of see how close it is to Jerusalem. Now, this may look really far away, but it's about a 15-minute drive, to give you guys an idea. So here at Adullam, his family comes from the area of Bethlehem and joins him at Adullam, because they are now in danger because of the seriousness with which Saul is pursuing David. And then after the family comes and joins them, then you have all of these people that come and join David that are the discontent and the people that are upset and no longer, under Saul. And so he starts building this group of discontents. And it gets up to about, I think, 600 at this point that are at Adullam. And a lot of these men become his mighty men and who are with him for all of the years. And this is kind of where he builds those relationships that end up being those that follow him throughout his kingdom. It's at this time, then, that David sends his family over to Moab and asks the king of Moab to protect them from Saul. And the king of Moab agrees to do that. He returns to Adullam, and then they find out that David is at Adullam, and he moves up to the forest of Hereth, which we don't know exactly where the forests of Hereth are. So the detail I missed from the notes is that it's a prophet that told them, you need to get out of Dodge and leave. And so they leave Adullam, they go to the forest of Hereth, and it's here that Saul discovers, it's at this time that actually is when Saul discovers that the priests had aided David, and that's when he has the entire city killed. And this is actually when Abiathar flees to David and joins him while he's in the forest of Hereth. The other thing is Abiathar at this point brings the linen ephod that has the Urim and Thummim in them that can help David with guidance. and may actually have been used when David goes and he defends the city of Keilah. So, sorry, that was Saul. So they know he's at Hareth, and so David flees to Keilah. He defends them, but then while he's in the city of Keilah, David inquires of the Lord as to whether they would keep him safe, but they don't. They betray him. They let Saul know where David is at, and so David then has to flee because Saul comes to Keilah to pursue him. So David flees into the wilderness of Ziph. Don't know exactly where the wilderness of Ziph is, but it was around in the area of the wilderness of Judah because of the other locations that are mentioned. And when he goes into the wilderness of Judah, Jonathan meets him at this point and secretly meets with him, affirms that he feels that the kingdom is going to go to David and that he will support him. And this is when he actually states to David, I will be there by your side and I will be helping you. And think about that in the transition. If something had happened to Saul and not Jonathan, and Jonathan had said, we need to make David king of Israel, everyone would have gone with it. Instead, what ends up happening is David ends up becoming king of Judah, and Israel takes a while to come around to taking him on as king. So while he's in this area of Ziph, the people in Ziph betray David to Saul, and Saul then goes and seeks to pursue him, but the Philistines attack, and he's called off. Now, it's during this time of Saul pursuing David. Let's see if I got this right here. No, this is where he goes and sorry, my brain, I'm tired. I believe it's here where they're going and they're on either side of the hill from each other. And Saul's not finding David, and then David ends up hiding in the cave. And then this is when Saul goes into the cave and ends up, David cuts off the corner of his garment. But that's when David fled to here, and he goes to En-Gedi after this time. But Saul goes into this cave to relieve himself. David could have easily taken his life. His men are arguing, saying, look, the Lord's handed him over to you. But David says, no, I won't raise my hand against the Lord's anointed. But he can't keep himself from reaching out and at least cutting off a piece of his robe. And then he feels guilty about cutting off a piece of his robe. And probably because he did it in a sense to mock him, and he felt it was disrespectful. So he comes out and he shows to Saul that he has that. And I think yeah, I'll let you guys read the story. You can know when Saul went back for the Philistines and this, but he ends up Saul after he is shown this piece of David's or of the robe that David cut off. He stops pursuing David for a time. And David has a reprieve. It's during this time of the reprieve that Samuel dies. So because there was this reprieve and the temporary peace between David and Saul, it allowed for both of them to join together to mourn Samuel and the whole nation to mourn Samuel in his passing. Then it's at this time that David so with David, you have the offense of Nabal. He goes up. I was hoping that I had a map for this, but I don't. Nope. So David, I'm going to go to the map just real quick. David's going all the way up here to Carmel, so you get a picture of how much he's wandering around. Because the story with Nabal is he's a Carmelite, and so David is going around in the area. He has his men with him. And what they're kind of doing is they are protecting Israelite interests from robbery and thievery and any other people coming in, but in providing that protection, both from wild animals and thieves, there's also kind of that sense that the people that he's doing that for would help provide for him food. So what happens, they're at a time of one of the holy feasts, and David has been watching Nabal's flocks. And then he sends a message to Nabal saying, hey, look, we've been watching your flocks. We could really use some supplies for the feast. And Nabal's like, who's this guy David? I don't care. Like, totally dismisses David in an insulting manner. And he sends messengers back to David. But Abigail, who is Nabal's wife, gets wind of this. And she realizes this is a big mistake. We are in big trouble. And so she puts together a whole bunch of supplies and everything and rushes to David to beat the messengers there, and basically, advises David not to kill Nabal. And what she's basically saying, it may not be plain when you first read it, what she's basically saying is that once you become king, you don't want to have any Israelite blood on your hands. You don't want to have that to be guilty of. And so David says, okay, I'm not going to avenge myself. Now, this is in contrast to Saul, who remembers, like, no one's going to eat food until I am avenged upon my enemies. Whereas David does not avenge himself. He instead goes with what Paul says later, vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. And this is the perfect example of a fulfillment of that passage. Because what happens is David does not avenge himself on Nabal, doesn't take his life. And Nabal's wife, Abigail, she doesn't tell Nabal that night, but the next morning she goes and she tells Nabal, and who knows what happens to him? Anyone? He dies. He actually what seems to happen, he seems to have had a stroke that morning as soon as she talks to him, and he dies a few days later. And so David ends up taking Abigail as his second wife. And then we are told at this time that he also marries Ahinoam of Jezreel, which again shows you how far north he's going as in his wanderings with his men. Now, when he takes these two wives, his daughter Michal, as soon as David fled and she helped him escape, his daughter Michal was taken and given to another man. Now, the interesting thing about this is that David is later, as we're going to see next week, David's going to demand to have Michal back as his wife. This actually is in violation of the law. The law does not allow a woman who has been divorced from one man to marry another to then go back to the original husband that she had. And so it's intriguing, and it goes to show you that, the fullness of the law is not always being applied in everything during this time, and yet God is still kind of blessing because he has that awareness of how they're not able to follow it every detail. Also, what we find a little bit through the stories we're going to see is that Michal so while David is now married to these two, Michal seems to have a good marriage with the second man she's married to. Because we're going to see that when David demands her back, the husband is coming behind crying, and they seem to have a decent marriage. And Michal and David are never, they don't get along again. We'll see that as well. So then, David once again is back in the wilderness. Okay, this is the other one that was confusing me in my brain. But so David. While he's back in the wilderness of Judah, the people once again betray his location to Saul. Saul comes out to capture and kill David. And this time, while Saul is encamped in the wilderness of Ziph pursuing him, David sneaks into the encampment with some of his men, and they take Saul's spear during the night. Then in the morning, when Saul gets up and he raises the spear and says, "Look what I could have done. Why are you coming after me? I am nothing." And Saul repents of his pursuit of David, affirms again that the kingdom's going to go to David. This is one of the other passages that I think the one that Max read, and then puts off pursuing David. In reality, this is the last time we know of him pursuing David, because he's going to be distracted by the Philistines, but David also leaves Israel and goes into the land of the Philistines at this point, so that Saul can no longer continue pursuing him because it's not safe enough. So David, not trusting that Saul's going to stop chasing him, he goes to the land of the Philistines, and he meets with the king Achish of Gath, and says, in essence, hey, I'm an enemy of Saul. The friend of my, or the enemy of my enemy is my friend, kind of thing. And so King of Gath gives him the city Ziklag, down in the south of Philistia, and this is closer to the wilderness, and so it's not hugely valuable, but he gives David a place to be, and then David offers his services and his army, in a sense, to serve the king of Gath. And so what David does is he goes and he raids Amalekite villages, and then says, "Oh, I raided these Israelite villages. King, here are the spoils." But he just makes sure no one survives from those Amalekite villages. So no witnesses survive. He goes, takes them, goes to Gath. And so the king of Gath thinks he's attacking Israel, and has become a stench to Israel and to Saul, and he's not worried, and he trusts David completely. So because of that, while David is in that position, Saul leaves from Gibeah, and they go up and they encamp here because there's a Philistine camp up in the Elah Valley, and they are going to attack there. And so David goes to Gath and says, "I want to join with you." I'm really curious what would have happened if he'd have got to join that battle. If he'd have turned, he would have. He would have turned in the middle of the battle and helped Saul. But the Israelites basically would not, the Philistines would not allow David to go with them. They're like, "We don't trust him." So the guys from the other cities, because remember there's 5 Philistine cities, the kings from the other cities are like, "We don't trust David. There's no way he's going to not turn on us, so he can't go with us." Well, while David is at Gath, meeting concerning that battle, the Amalekites, who he's been raiding, come and they take Ziklag, and they take a bunch of people captive, all their families captive, all of their things captive, and leave. So during the battle, while Saul and Jonathan and them are having the battle with the Philistines and Saul is being killed, David is actually having a battle with the Amalekites, taking back who has been kidnapped from the families and such. And so David pursues them and recaptures everything. When he did that, you guys remember me talking about having that camp in the back with all of your baggage and your stuff that you don't take into battle with you. Well, an argument broke out amongst David's men that the people that were back in the baggage, who didn't have to go into battle, didn't get to have as much of the spoils as the rest of those that went into the battle. And David says, "No, it's equal." They had to stay back because someone had to stay back. And how are you going to get people to stay back if you never let them have any of the spoils? But not only that, they were in danger staying back. They could have easily been attacked and stuff. So David gives this equal plunder to them, which gives an example of wisdom for us in different similar situations in life, where these people are out actually doing the work and these people have to do something that may be more mundane, but is just as important. And so David ends up recapturing them and rescuing everybody from his group. Meanwhile, however, up in the north, you have the Philistine encampment here. The Israelite army has come up here most likely to fight against the Philistine encampment and kick it out of this area. And then you have Saul, who's looking at the possibility of this battle, and he wants to know, am I going to be able to go into battle? When he inquires of the Lord, it seems he no longer is getting any answer, and Samuel is dead. And so he's like, what am I going to do? So Saul goes up to this place in Endor, which is close to the Philistine camp on the other side of a hill, and decides to consult a medium or a witch and asks her to bring up Samuel. And she succeeds. You want to talk about one of the weirdest stories and boy, ever wanting to be there. But she is actually having this attempt to consult the dead, and the person who shows up is Samuel, and she suddenly realizes the person she's talking to is Saul. Now, she's scared to death because Saul has said, I'm going to put to death any witches or any mediums. So Saul's actually violating his own law, breaking his own law, and has to comfort her, like, don't worry, I'm not going to do that. And then, Samuel's like, why did you bring me up from Sheol? Now, and that's an interesting statement, because he's not saying, why have you brought me down from the presence of the Lord? He's saying, why have you brought me up from Sheol, which talks about a different state for Old Testament saints when they die than what we find in the New Testament, where Paul says absent from the body is what? Present with the Lord. So this is one of those things that feeds into part of the whole theological discussion of whether or not the Old Testament saints went down to a Sheol that Christ then descended into after the cross and then led the souls out. It doesn't in any way solve that whole discussion, but it's part of what needs to be considered, that he is coming up from Sheol. So Saul, when he consults this witch and Samuel comes, he basically is informed that you are not going to win, you are going to lose. So in this battle, the Philistines, the main force, comes up to reinforce the camp. They fight against Israel at Mount Gilboa, and it is in this battle that Saul, Jonathan, and Saul's two other sons are killed, and that is the end of the life of Saul when God finally removes him. And so what we'll see next week is what happens as a result once David is then brought into power, and we'll go from there. So any questions that you guys have? And we can actually, tonight, because we're ending a little bit early, we can entertain questions from the lesson, and then if there's none of those, we'll open it up for just open Q&A. You guys can ask anything you want. So, yes?
I don't know if you've thought about this or not, but when David and his men were at Ziklag, the wives were there, including his wives, and children were there.
Mm-hmm.
They weren't traveling around and hiding in these caves with David. So it must have been a while that they lived in Ziklag and kind of built that up as their home, and the families were all there. And I don't know how they rounded all those people out.
Yeah, it's. I know when David was in the caves of Adullam, he wasn't so Michael had been taken from him, so he didn't have a wife there, but he did for a time bring his family there. The men that were coming to him were kind of riffraff, so I don't know if they had families. But once they got to Ziklag, yeah, they had the families there at Ziklag. When all of that happened, good question.
Where did they all go afterwards?
Yeah.
Those details we don't get to know.
Yep. And so Adullam, where David hid for a good while from Saul, you can go there today. I had a chance to go there. I have a rock in my office with, it's next to the ones that are from the creek bed. But it's a rock that I pulled from one of the caves of Adullam. And what's cool is it's a hill that along the whole crest of the hill, there's multiple large caves. Somewhere there's just an opening about this big that drops down into this large opening and below where you probably would have had to have a ladder to get down into it. And then you could take the ladder down and no one could get in without injuring themselves. Other caves that meandered through parts of the hill with different rooms, and they actually have fire pits dug into the rock or chiseled into the rock, so you can see where those were, and to stop and realize this is where David was. To me, it was one of the more amazing places to go in Israel, because it so clearly was someplace David had been, and you knew it. And because there's one cave especially that I would in my mind think was the one that he probably would have been in, simply because it had this huge vista of a view looking north toward where Saul and them would have been coming from. So it was kind of you could see the entire valley of Elah, and how it continued on up to where Jerusalem and Gibeah and all those were. And so he would have had a great shot of anyone coming to get him if he was staying there. So now if you're standing on Adullam, it's just right at the bottom of the hill on the east side is the fence for the West Bank. So it's a pretty stark contrast too. You can look to the one side and you've got trees, stuff like that, and as soon as you look over to the West Bank, it's just barren. So it's really kind of a shocking thing to look at with modern politics as well. Any other questions?
Well, I remember from Bible Study Fellowship that, and it was really shocking to me. I believe they said that David ran from Saul for 14 years. And so, and then you begin to understand a little better his Psalms, and
Yep.
how what he was going through during that time, and what a terrible time it was for him.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because this is not, we went over it pretty quick. So it looks like, this is a couple months. It's not a couple months. This is years of him fleeing Saul. And there's a lot of stuff happening, in between these. Another place to visit in Israel is En-Gedi, which is where David also hid from Saul. And En-Gedi is just beautiful. It's a series of waterfalls in this valley that leads down to the Dead Sea. And so they had a constant source of water, but there were caves up in there. But there's one place at the very, if you're doing the very simple hike, it's where the simple hike ends. You can go up on the valley walls and go up higher, but the simple hike ends at this like 25 foot waterfall. But up at the top is just this little crevice that comes up that's maybe about like this wide, and you just had a thing, you hide me in the cleft of the rock. It's like you just see a group of guys up in that area and just hiding where you just can't be seen, but the rocks are kind of all around you, hiding you. So it really was kind of neat to be in that area. Not to mention the wildlife. They have the ibex, I think they're called, that are just, they're walking so close to you, you could just reach out, grab their horns, which I wouldn't advise. But yeah, it's kind of a neat place to go. Any other questions?
Yeah, right.
Hey, any questions just in general? Any you guys thought of?
Why does Mount Gilboa have a striking resemblance to the Detroit Lions logo?
Something about the losses, most likely. Thank you, though. Appreciate it. If you do go to Israel and you go up on Mount Tabor, which is where the Church of the Transfiguration is, because that's traditionally the site. I don't know that I believe that that's the site, but it actually has a really beautiful vista of Mount Gilboa that's hard to get into a photograph. So even though I have a photograph of it, if I showed it to you, you'd just be looking at, okay, wow, that's really interesting. It's just a hill. But it does have a nice vista of Mount Gilboa, and you realize it's like a ridge line that goes along there, and you can see it. And you can see this entire battlefield from that. This right there is Mount Tabor. So it's this big peak that you can see all this whole area in the vista, and kind of where that battle would have gone on. So, okay. Any other questions?
How did you, when you went to Israel, you didn't go with a group, I presume?
It was me and 3 other individuals. We rented a car, stayed in hostels, and just went all over the place. So it was a lot of fun. And it was a lot quicker. We got a lot more done because you didn't have this tour bus of people shopping that you had to wait for. And we just were able to zip from here to there. We got more into a 5-day trip than most people get into a 2-week trip.
5 days.
Wow.
Yep, it was a lot of fun. I was very sore though afterwards, and that's definitely a jet lag trip.
Uh-huh.
Definitely a jet lag trip. Yeah. Well, and I was disappointed because we got up at like 5 a.m. to go hike Masada, and it's a plateau that King Herod built a palace on top of it down by the Dead Sea, which means it's hot. And so we got up at 5 a.m. And because of the time change, we're like, this is no problem. I can get up at 5 a.m., no problem. So we get up at 5 a.m. and we get ready to go hike. And we were going to do it while it was, dark, and then watch the sunrise. And got to the bottom of the parking ramp, and the gate was closed, and we couldn't get out. And we couldn't go back because of the spike strip. So there we sat for an hour waiting for them to open the gate. And by that time, the sun rose, and now all my pictures have me sweaty as all get out when I'm on top of Masada instead. And we did the dumb thing. We hiked up Masada and then took the tram down. You should, take the tram up and then hike down if you're smart. Just my advice to you guys. But yeah.
That's what I did.
Yep. Why didn't you tell me, Jim? So, all right. Any other questions you guys have? Remember, it could be anything. You guys being nice to me. I had a pickup Joy at O'Hare last night. It was supposed to pick her up at 11:30, and we got home at 3:30. So it was her flight got delayed and everything else and whatnot. So, all right. Well, we'll go ahead and we'll see you guys next week.
Thanks, Lee.
Yep.